When I was a child, my parents never let me have sugary cereal. And that was dumb. It was really dumb. I get it. Like, I'm not a parent, but I imagine what it's like to be a parent sometimes. I'm around a lot of parents, and so I can imagine what it's like. And I can also sometimes imagine what it's like to be a parent of me when I was a child. I was already pretty hyper. I don't know if that's surprising to you guys, but I was already a little bit wired in a way that was difficult to deal with. And so I feel like, most sugary cereals, if we get right down to it, is basically just like powdered Red Bull and milk. And my parents didn't want to give me powdered Red Bull and milk for the same reason that Stephanie doesn't want to give me liquid Red Bull now. And so they just never did it. And so the problem was they said no sugary cereal, but the real issue was that if you look on television, on TV, everything I was watching had commercials, and all those commercials were telling me that I needed to eat sugary cereal. Like Fred Flintstone didn't have one cereal, that dude had two. One of them had to be awesome. There was a leprechaun. He had gold at the end of a rainbow. And marshmallows. I wanted to have those. There was Tony the Tiger. Tony the Tiger, like he played soccer. He was really, really good at soccer. There was Toucan Sam. He couldn't spell fruit, but that's okay. I think. Isn't it on the box F-R-O-O-T? Yeah, Michael knows. Couldn't spell fruit, but I'm sure his cereal was delicious. I never had it, but I knew that I was cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. I just knew I was. And it's interesting because I would ask for it, my parents would be like, no. And I get it. Again, I understand. But then my parents did this thing where they're like, hey, Drew, this is sugary. And they bought the frosted mini wheats. You guys ever had those? Like they have sugar on one side. I will give my parents that. But like the whole frosted mini wheat is, I don't know if you guys knew this. I Googled it. It is actually made out of old pizza boxes put through a paper shredder. And they make them into cereal, slap some sugar on it, and say, here, kids, eat this. And it's terrible. And so my whole life, like I wanted sugary cereal, and my parents were like, here's Cheerios. And I'm like, well, that's not even the honey nut variety. That's just regular Cheerios. Whole life, it was really dumb. So then I got old enough to go to college. And I had freedom. And I could do anything. I could go anywhere. I could drive and do anything. Like I had absolute control over my life. And what that meant was I could eat sugary cereal. That was the most important thing. And I got to work, guys. I got to work making up for lost time. And there was this one time where I was working at a grocery store in Moberly, Missouri, and I was stocking these shelves, and there was this new cereal. And I had gone through the cereal aisle at this point. Like, I'd eaten all of them. I tried all of them. I had my favorites. I had power rankings. If you guys know me, I'm big on ranking things in ordered lists, and I had the ranking lists, and I see what I can only imagine is just absolutely the greatest thing ever. They were called Oreo O's. Oreo O's. And what they were, if you can imagine this, like imagine like a Fruit Loop or an Applejack, like circle, like texture and size, except you know that drug that's in Oreos that makes all of us like it? It's like the condensed form of it in milk. There's a drug reference I want to make right now. I'm not gonna. But if maybe you think of it in your head. This is the crystallized version of the drug in the Oreos. And you know it, like Oreos aren't that good, guys. They don't taste very good, but right now if I offered you a bag of Oreos, you would eat the whole thing before the end of this sermon, and you know it. And it's dumb because they're not even that good, but you do it because this is what we do. Anyway, so cereal is like that, but like times 10. And so I sit down and I'm doing homework or whatever, and I start eating the cereal. I eat a bowl, and I'm like, yeah, that makes me hyper. Let's do more of that. And then I got a second bowl, and I was like, inject this in my veins. And I got the third one and the fourth one, and in like 45 minutes, the box was gone. And I'd eaten an entire family-sized box of Oreo O's. because I could. And it was awesome. For a little bit. I'm not going to go into details of what happened afterwards. Those were dark times in my life. A lot of pain, a lot of confusion, a lot of wondering, well, where did that come from? It was bad. It was interesting because a little bit later, they actually took it off the market. And I'll just tell you, what happened for the next 3 days after I ate this box of Oreo O's made me realize, yeah, they should take that off the market. That is not food, guys. That is not healthy. No one should touch these. And at least maybe they should eat a whole box of them. And it's then that I realized that, I thought that it was dumb that my parents wouldn't let me have sugary cereal. But turns out my parents just knew that I was really dumb. And they knew, don't give this to our son. I tell you this to bring up a very obvious point. And this is a point I don't think we need to say, but we're going to anyway, because I think it's really important, okay? Just because you can do something, like eat an entire box of cereal in one sitting, that is basically drugs and sugar, just because you can do something does not mean you should do that something. Just because we can, we have the freedom, we have the ability, does not mean that it is healthy or good or positive in any way for us to do that something. And we all know this. We all know, you can tomorrow go quit your job. You have the ability to do that. You have absolutely you could go in and just walk in and tell your boss, yeah, I'm done. And say terrible things to your boss and just walk out. And it may feel really good, honestly. But you probably shouldn't if you have, rent due. We understand, you can drive 120 miles an hour. You can do that. Get in your car and just gun it, and you can, at least that's what the speedometer gets to. You can drive that fast, but you probably shouldn't, because you'll probably wreck, and if not, you'll get a ticket, and if not, then you just shouldn't. We know that there are things that we can do. We have the ability, we have the freedom, we have the wherewithal to do them, but we shouldn't do them. We constantly make decisions in our lives as human beings. We are constantly weighing out the algebraic equation between what we can do and what we should do. What maybe we want to do that would feel good in a moment, and what would be healthy in the even short, long term. We are constantly working these things out in our heads, in our hearts, in our souls. We are constantly weighing out what is it that I should do and why. Because there is a difference between what we can do and what we should do. And when we talk about these things spiritually, when we talk about this stuff as Christian people, this becomes exceedingly important. This is maybe the defining quality in what it means to live out the truth of the gospel. And for more on that, let's talk about a saint by the name of Clare. Clare lived, 800 years or so ago. She lived in Italy, in a town called Assisi. And Clare, what we need to know about Clare is a couple of things. The first thing we need to know about Clare is that her father was a count. Truth be told, I don't know what a count does. I don't know why a count is impressive. But I do know that a count is impressive, and if you ever wonder, is a count really impressive, just remember this. Count Dracula is a count. Think this through. Here's a guy famous for sucking the blood of the innocent. He's an undead demon monster. That guy could totally just go by one name. We've got Cher, we've got Oprah, right? Dracula has earned the right to go by only Dracula. But he has held on to Count Dracula, which tells me that being a count, that's pretty awesome. And if you need more evidence, let's go to real life. Claire's father was a count. Claire's father owned 2 homes. In and of itself, 800 years ago, in the Middle Ages, in Europe, that was impressive. If you owned any piece of property, you were doing really well for yourself. If you owned any kind of home, you were doing really well for yourself. If you owned multiples of anything, you were doing well for yourself. Like if you've got 2 cows, good for you. This guy has 2 homes. One of them is a literal palace within the walls of Assisi. Within the city of Assisi, he owned a palace. The second one was a literal castle in the mountains outside of Assisi. This guy, the Count, he owned a palace and a castle. Again, if you own a palace or a castle, that is a sign of ridiculous wealth, the likes of which none of us can understand. This guy owned both. And Claire was born into this family, into this world in which she was essentially the richest person anywhere around. She was the richest little girl in her city, in her region, in her country. No one had more than her. And that's the first thing we have to know. The second thing is this. Claire was renowned for being the single most beautiful woman, young girl, young woman, whatever, where their marriage law is a little bit different back in the day. You know, teenagers are considered of marrying age, but she was considered the most beautiful woman, maiden that you could pursue for marriage. I mean, life is a lot like, life has changed between 800 years ago and today. Life is different in America than in Italy. That's the way this is. But really, if you've got all the money ever and you're the most beautiful human ever, you have power and privilege that really can't be described. Claire could have done anything with her life, is what I'm trying to say. She had money to do anything. She was beautiful in a way that literally every suitor that exists wanted her hand. And not just because of the money. Claire could have done anything with her life. She was the definition of the freedom to do anything. She didn't just have the ability to eat the whole box of cereal. She could have bought the cereal factory. She could have married the cereal maker. She could have made her own cereal island and just ate cereal all day. It would have been bad news for her. But she could have done it. So the question is, what does Claire decide to do with her life? This person who has literally everything. What does she decide to do with her life? Well, one day she goes to church, which was Catholic Mass, and she goes to Catholic Mass, and they have a guest speaker there. His name is Francis. You may, by putting together 2 words that I've said, realize that I'm talking about Francis of Assisi. He's a very famous saint, maybe the most famous saint, because one of his really famous quotes became a meme, and they get shared on the internet all the time, and it's preach the gospel always, if necessary, use words. Have you heard that quote before? On this day, Francis decided to preach the gospel, and it was necessary to use words. So he was in the church, and he was preaching, and that's what he was doing. And thank you, Parker, for thinking that was funny. No one else? Okay, that's fine. I liked it. So Francis is preaching this sermon, and Claire is in the crowd, and she's listening, and she's hearing all this stuff, and she just says, "Man, I know what I want to do." And she says, I want to serve God in the church, which for her meant becoming a nun. With her tradition and the age that she lived in, it meant being a nun, and that meant not getting married. And that meant, leaving the family fortune. And that meant giving everything up. But Claire spoke to Francis, and they talked about it, and she said, this is what I want to do. I know it's what I want to do. And she said, my dad's not going to want this. His uncles and all these people, they're not going to want this, but this is what I want. And so she weighs out that algebraic formula of what you can do and what you should do. And she says, not only can I join the church this way, but I should. I can become a nun, and I should. And so she actually left in the middle of the night. She kind of escapes, and her father finds out. He's a count. Of course he's going to find out. And so her father and his brothers go and try to go apprehend her. And here's what's amazing, you think about this story, her father could have just literally picked her up and just taken her home. She's a teenager, right? You parents of teenagers, there comes a point where I'm just going to pick you up and throw you over my shoulder like a sack of potatoes. We're going home. He could have done that. He had the legal right to do anything he wanted. He is the count. But he and his brothers spoke to her, and she explained why she wanted to do this. And her father, who has dreams of a wedding and children and heirs and everything else, just said, okay. She convinced her father. And so she goes and she becomes a nun, and she gives up every piece of wealth she's ever had. Every possession. Literally, she joined an order that actually forbade having possessions. In this nun order, this sisterly order, you were not allowed to own a single possession. Corporately, the nuns as a collective group were not allowed to own a possession. That's how hardcore they were about being in poverty. They didn't own shoes. They didn't have beds. They slept on the dirt. They didn't eat meat, which in a related story, they constantly were sick with stomach problems. For her entire life, Claire suffered. For her entire life, Claire lived a life of abject, complete poverty. And so all Claire did was pray. And that's where the story gets, real saintly. Because, to be a saint, you got to have some miracles. She is Saint Claire. And Saint Claire had these at least two miracles, because she was in a town that was peaceful, filled with women and children, and of course, the world's not always peaceful. And so there was a German king who wanted to come take over Italy, and he invades the beaches where they were, and Claire, who was very, very sick, gets out of her her rest of being sick, and she prayed and she served communion to her sisters and anyone else who could come. And the German army reported seeing really odd miracles, really odd things in this town that basically told them, let's not fight here. And so they left. A couple years later, another larger army, another general, another king came with the same thing. And this time, once again, Claire does her thing. She serves communion, she prays, and a massive storm wipes out a fleet of ships. And that was enough for all the other armies to say, so something weird's over there, let's not invade. And for the rest of her life, that's exactly what happened. Now, you might not believe that. You may think that's... it just doesn't. That kind of stuff doesn't happen. I don't know. That's up to you. But what is true and undeniable is today, in 75 countries, there are hundreds of thousands. Or tens of thousands. I don't know the number. Many thousands of poor Claires who live a life like she did. This legacy that's lasted 800 years. And I hear this story, and I think it's fascinating for a lot of reasons. I think it's the miracle stuff is fascinating. The count stuff is obviously fascinating. Who has a castle and a palace, But I think what's most fascinating is this question, and that is why. Why would somebody like Claire, the most beautiful young woman in Italy, could have her pick of any suitor that has ever existed? The most wealthy young woman in Italy. If she doesn't want to get married, she doesn't have to. She is taken care of for 100 lifetimes with what she has financially. Why would she turn her back on a family? Why would she turn her back on comfort? Why would she turn her back on wealth? Why would she take her future and essentially torpedo it so that way she could go sleep in dirt, not have shoes, have a stomach ache for 30 years, and pray? Claire had everything. And she weighed out this equation of what you can do and what you should do, and she came to the conclusion that she should just deny everything. And I have to ask the question, why? Now, I don't know the answer to that. Not for certain. I've not spoken to her about it. But I think I know the answer. And I think that answer is this. I think that Claire understood Babylon better than any of us do. You see, last week we began this sermon series where we talked about Babylon. And we may not think of it too much because this is not who we are as Christians very often. We don't always talk about this sort of thing. But in the Bible, Babylon is an incredibly common word, a very common concept, both in a historical sense, being Babylon was this empire, this nation that conquered the Jews, took the Jews into exile, all of that stuff. That was true for Babylon. But then it becomes a spiritual metaphoric thing, an allegorical phrase representing something we talked about last week, what it represents. That Babylon, when we read about Babylon in the New Testament, when we read about it in Revelation, when we read about it in the Psalms, that Babylon represents those things in this world that are trying to indoctrinate us. Babylon is those things in this world that are trying to convert us. Anywhere, when you hear somebody say, believe this, act like this, buy this, vote this, whatever, do this and you will be on my side and you will be happy, you have encountered Babylon. Babylon is that in this world which is a strive for power and wants to use us to get it. Babylon is constantly referred to by nations, by government leaders, economies, businesses. We talked last week how it absolutely filters down into religions. Babylon, absolutely, the historical Babylon included their religion in this. Babylon is everywhere. We live in Babylon. We are constantly inundated with pictures and ideas and the call from people, conform to us, trade who you are for who we are, and you will be happy. And you know what's interesting? Jesus one day was talking about the wealthy. He was talking about money. And he said at the end, his conclusion was that it is more difficult for those who are wealthy to experience and live within the kingdom of God than those who are not wealthy. And I think that is connected. Because the more that we have, the more likely we will be to believe that we can find peace through buying things. We can find peace through collecting things. We can find peace through acquiring things. That there is peace in consumption. And if I'm right about that, and I'm pretty sure I am, Claire saw that. This is a girl who had everything. Everything. This is a girl a young woman, who had more money than every person in this room combined. And she looked at it and said, but at what cost? But at what cost? And she looked at all of it and said, this is not worth it. This is not worth my soul. This is not worth who I am. Babylon is not worth it. And so she decided that what she would simply choose was none of it. I can have everything in the world. I choose none of it. And we remember her 800 years later. Claire is, of course, not alone. That is not a decision only Claire made. In fact, Claire was following in the footsteps of probably the most famous apostle. His name is Paul. Also a saint. We could call him Saint Paul if we wanted. We also call him the Apostle Paul if we wanted, but he's basically just Paul. Paul gave up an awful lot to be a Christian. I don't know that we always think about that, but Paul was a Pharisee. Paul had power. Paul had wealth. Okay, it was just like it is today. You're not in charge if you have money. And in the ancient Israelite world in the first century under Rome, the people who ruled had money, they had everything, and Paul was one of those guys. To follow Jesus was to give up his voice, was to give up his power. It was to give up his money. It was to give up everything to follow Jesus. And so it maybe shouldn't surprise us that one day he's writing a letter to the ancient church of Corinth, and he's explaining to them what it means to be a disciple, what it means, he says, to follow the law of Christ. Because after all, we live in Babylon, but Jesus is our king. And so whether or not we live in Babylon, whether or not we are surrounded and inundated by this, we still follow the law of Christ. So Paul explained what that means. He explained it in a weird way, though. He started by talking about the other apostles, and it almost sounds like a passive-aggressive dig, but it's not. He says, listen, the other apostles do all sorts of stuff that I don't do. All sorts of stuff I would never do. He says, like Peter, for example. Peter, when he travels, he takes his wife with him. Peter goes town to town preaching, doing everything else. He takes his wife. Paul says he is totally allowed to do that. He is perfectly within his rights to do that. Just like I am perfectly within my rights to also have a wife and take her along. But Paul said, I choose to not do that. He said in the other apostles, Peter and the other apostles, he says, wherever they go, however they preach, wherever they do anything they do, they get paid. It's not always in money. Sometimes it's just in lodging. Sometimes it's in food. But they get paid. And Paul said it is perfectly within their rights to do that. In fact, Paul says it is not just within their rights to do that. It is God himself who in the Old Testament, in the law of Moses, as we understand these things, God is the one who said that when somebody works, they should get paid. When somebody puts in a day's labor, they should be paid fairly. They should be compensated righteously. And he says when it comes to God's workers, people who are preaching and teaching and representing God, he says actually they should be paid more. And Paul says, but I don't take a single cent. I don't take a single meal. I don't take a single bed. Paul says, I can do all of these things. It is my right to have these things. But I have said no. And while I don't know why Claire does what she does, I can only guess, although I think I'm right. Paul, he just tells us. Here's what he says in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. This is what Paul says he does and why. He says, even though I am a free man with no master, I have become a slave to all people to bring many to Christ. When I was with the Jews, I lived like a Jew to bring the Jews to Christ. When I was with those who follow the Jewish law, I too lived under that law. Even though I'm not subject to the law, I did this so I could bring to Christ those who are under the law. When I am with the Gentiles who do not follow the Jewish law, I too live apart from that law so I can bring them to Christ. But I do not ignore the law of God. I obey the law of Christ. This is one of the more difficult passages in the Bible, not because of what it means, not because of we can't understand it, but because I don't like it. What Paul is saying is this: I have worked the algebraic formula out. I can do all sorts of things. But if my goal is to show the love of Christ to all people, if my goal is to reach as many people as possible, I will only do those things that reach them. Well, Paul says we live in this culture where we think it's like a good thing to live a life and say, I don't care who I offend. It's fine to be offensive. Who cares? Well, answering that non-rhetorically, Paul cares. Paul lives his life in such a way that does not offend anyone on purpose, to the point of not taking a wife, to the point of not getting paid. which makes sense for a million different reasons. But again, we see it in our world too. I mean, how many times do you see people accuse preachers of oh, they're just in it for money? Paul takes that off the table. I'm in it for money. Why have I never gotten paid? Paul does what he does solely for the benefit of other people. Paul understood and goes to the extreme. He understood the principle that our individual wants, needs, and rights are not and have never been more important than collectively we as a people's rights, needs, and wants. Who we are as people, as individuals, is not more important than who we are collectively as people. And I think we all get that. But Paul, understanding that better than maybe anyone else, takes it so far to an extreme to where he's literally saying, God said I could have it, and I'm saying no. The other apostles are doing it, and I'm saying no. Now listen, I'm not saying we all have to be Paul. That's not what I'm saying. But if Paul is following the law of Christ, we have to understand that the law of Christ means this. The law of Christ means we understand and we put into action the truth that other people's needs and wants and rights are absolutely as important or more important than ours. That's what it means to love your neighbor. That's what it means to treat other people the way we'd like to be treated. That's what all of this has always meant. And so often we say, yeah, but I can do this. It is so easy to be selfish and say, I'm going to do the thing that I want to do. Remember the story I told. I ate a whole box of cereal, guys. When I say we, I mean we. This is something that all of us struggle with. And Paul says, in everything I do, because I am following the law of Christ, in everything I do it so as to not offend other people, and more than even that, to put their needs and wants and rights ahead of mine. And in doing so, I am following the law of Christ. Babylon is all over this world, surrounds us. Babylon is saying, believe this, say this, vote this, act like this, think like this, buy this, live in this, drive this, eat this, look like this, weigh this. Babylon is screaming at us, be selfish, and when you are sufficiently selfish, you will find peace. And the law of Christ says, it is by turning our backs on that selfishness that we actually find peace. Living a life in which we are sensitive to the needs of other people. So not that we don't want to offend people because, they're going to be offended, but because we actually care about who they are enough to where we actually want their feelings not be hurt. Because we understand that their needs and wants and rights and desires are more important than ours, are as important as ours, because Christ loves them as much as he loves us. Babylon will never satisfy us. There will always be the next thing to buy. There will always be the next thing to consume. There will always be the next experience to have. There will always be the next thing to do. The next president to elect. There will always be the next food to eat. The next size to get down to. Always. But if we follow the law of Christ, then we are simply putting others first. And look, we are free. Peter took a wife. The other apostles got paid. Paul didn't. They all made the choice based on who they were and what they could handle. But they all put other people first, knowing that what we can do is not necessarily what we should. This morning, on our second week of our series called The Law in Babylon, as we consider the path of St. Clare, the path of St. Paul, the pull of this world, we find a fascinating lesson that is very difficult. Our second lesson from the law in Babylon is this: we can use our freedom to be selfish. We should use it to serve God and other people. We can use our freedom to be selfish, but we should use it to serve God and other people. In the end, this is one of those lessons that we Christians should be great at. Because at the end of the day, when you talk about selfishness is this idea that we are the center of the world, right? And if we believe in Jesus, if we understand that Jesus is God's Son, died and risen, and that's the way that is, then we should know that Christ is the center of the world, right? Theoretically, I shouldn't have to preach this sermon to a room full of Christians. And yet I'll just throw this number out again. 40,000. There are 40,000 denominations of Christianity in this world. And you know how all those denominations got to be? What happened was this: somebody didn't get their way. And so then that somebody said, I know what I'll do. I'll make a church where I can get my way all the time. And then they go and they have their own church, and that goes for a while. And then another guy in that church is like, yeah, but I want to get my way. And he's like, no. And he said, okay, cool, well, I'll go start my own church where I get my way. 40,000 denominations, guys. I dare say that Babylon is in the church. I dare say that selfishness is alive and well in the church. And I dare say we may be worse at it than other people. And if I can be even maybe a little bit bolder, we live in a country that has been predominantly Christian the entire time. We can argue about semantics, are we a Christian country or not, but the bottom line is we got 80% Christians in this country. We have been in power and in control since day one. I am used to getting my way. You are used to getting your way. We are all used to that, at least on some level as Christians. Because we have been the dominant majority here since the beginning of our country. So you put those two things together. And an American Christian is going to look at this, is going to see this, and at least this American Christian is going to bristle and say, yeah, but I like getting my way. I like having my freedom. I like doing what I like doing. I like not worrying if other people are offended. I like all that stuff. The law of Christ is screaming to us because we have been so corrupted by Babylon. We are used to being able to say, you know what I'm going to do tonight? I'm going to take the box of cereal, I'm going to eat it all right now, and I'm not going to worry about tomorrow. But St. Clare and St. Paul have shown us a better way. A way of service, a way of selflessness, a way of understanding that other people are more important than we are, because they are as important as we are. And so at the end of the day, to follow Christ, to serve and be driven by the law of Christ, is to use our freedom to help other people. In whatever way we can, however it is that we are, to use our freedom each and every day to help the needs of people that are not us. That is the invitation, that is the gospel, and that is what Christ has offered. So when the musicians are going to come forward, they're going to sing a song. We offer an invitation to take Jesus up on this, to turn our backs on who we used to be. That is called repentance. In repentance, we have a picture of that in baptism. The old self dies, the new self is born again. We're brand new people. And we are people driven by the law of Christ. People not driven by Babylon. People who live lives of love, because that is truly the path to peace. If you made a decision, we've got a nice warm baptistry. We've got all sorts of people who can do it. Let's talk. If you're an immersed believer in Christ looking for a perfect church home, this place is not it. We do serve a perfect God. We want to connect, we want to call, we want to cultivate, we want to meet new people, we want to share the gospel while we do it, and we want to grow up while we do that. At the end of the day, we can do a lot of things. But we should only do those things which are loving to others. As we stand and as we sing.